welcome everybody to this NSF program, to the first program, I hope, of many in our partnership with the START Center from the University of Maryland. I am thrilled to have our panelists join us today. I think this will be a very interesting discussion. So with that, I'm thrilled to have Bill Braniff, the director of START, to give you just a short opening and describe what START is, and then he will turn it over to his lead researchers to present today's talk. So with that, Bill, please.
Maureen, thank you so much. And thanks to everybody for joining us. It's not for the faint of heart to come to an hour-long talk on cartel violence. So I appreciate your time and energy today. I'll be really brief. START is a public good. We're a terrorism research center at our base, so we're 15 years old. We have a very long-standing relationship with the Department of Homeland Security, but over the years we've diversified and work really across the interagency now, doing a lot of work for the Department of Defense, state, the DHS components, the Department of Justice, as well as the intelligence community, and a lot of work, frankly, now for the private sector. So we've done a lot of more applied research in the private sector in recent years, and we hope to be a resource for you going forward. So Maureen mentioned the start of a relationship. That's exactly what we would love, is a relationship going forward. We answer hundreds of requests for information a year. We see that as part of our mission statement, is to take the research that we're doing and get it out to real people with real jobs so that this information can be put to use. So I hope you'll take us up on that. Just by way of background, I'm a former Army officer. I worked in nuclear counterterrorism with the National Nuclear Security Administration. Worked at West Point, my alma mater, running, teaching cadets and then running training for the FBI and the Special Operations Community, CIA University, the Foreign Service, a whole host of interagency partners. So we really tried to be there as central resource, and I've taken those relationships with me to START at the University of Maryland. We're primarily a terrorism research center, but we're not exclusively a terrorism research center. If you're studying terrorism, you're also studying transnational criminality. You're also studying influence operations and how propaganda, whether that's state propaganda or terrorist propaganda, can be used to manipulate populations. So we study a lot of tangential topics around things, the topic of terrorism and counterterrorism. And so as you'll hear today, a lot of our methods, the multidisciplinary methods that we bring from across the behavioral and social sciences, can be applied to asymmetric threats of various kinds. I think with that, I'll turn it over to our two subject matter experts, Dr. Mark Boyd and Dr. Sam Henkin, who are the brains behind the operation, the cartel work that we'll talk about today. But I do really hope you'll sincerely reach out to us if we can be of any use. And with that, I will turn the floor over. Thank you so much.
And thank you very much for joining us. I really appreciate it. So with that, Marcus.
So welcome, everyone. Thank you very much for coming and joining us today. I'm Marcus Boyd, as you all know. I have been with START for 6 years. I head up the Geospatial Research Unit. Prior to coming to START, I was at the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency and then Domestic Nuclear Detection Office. So I have worked in counterproliferation more globally, and have also done some terrorism research prior to coming to START. But primarily, I'm an economic and social geographer interested in cartels and transnational criminal organizations, illicit finance, gray networks, and the like. Sam, did you want to quickly introduce yourself as well?
Sure. I'm Samuel Henkin. As has been invited, you have a quick bio of me, but briefly, I transitioned to START from academia. I am a political geographer and whose past and current research is broadly concerned with how political violence is exercised strategically to accomplish certain spatial, social, and political ends. So everything from political violence and instability to domestic terrorism, countering violent extremism, and illicit and dark networks.
So to give you a quick introduction and overview of what we do writ large, so our team is sort of agnostic in where we do our research. As you can see, we've done research in Malaysia, in Africa, in Mexico, Central America. So more or less globally, specifically with the transnational illicit trafficking, where we have been very interested in how we can blend social science methods and particularly geospatial and geographic methods to better understand how organizations move things around the world, whether it's people or weapons, drugs, what have you. And this sort of brings me into the trafficking cartel, because really this project itself comes out of earlier research that we did looking specifically at terrorist organizations, and specifically the Islamic State, the so-called Islamic State. This is really an outcome of years of research, and I expect that there'll be years more worth of research. This is one of our visuals that Sam created. It's, as far as we know, the most up-to-date and accurate assessment of where cartels are presently, what their strengths are, and basically what the flows look like generally. So as I was saying, the project itself that we're currently working on involves our group, so START, the Criminal Investigation and Network Analysis Center, CINA, which is at George Mason University, and the Center for Accelerating Operational Efficiency, which is at the Arizona State University. Initially, our work was interested in how criminal organizations fund themselves. And as I was saying, the Islamic State specifically, how does the Islamic State fund itself? And there was some research indicating that they were using basically fabricated drugs, narcotics, to fund some of their efforts. This led me down a pathway of looking at illicit financing more broadly, and I sort of settled in on cartels. And what we soon discovered was that there is no real cartel activity database. So START is most famous for our global terrorism database, which is an event level database that goes back to 1970 and has every terrorist attack globally since the 70s. We're very proud of that database, but I was looking at it and I was realizing that cartel activity wasn't really in there because it doesn't fit the definitions of terrorism as we define them. But nobody was really doing this. There had been some attempts previously, but those had largely stopped around about 2011, 2012. And so we were interested in well, could we do this? And that's really what instantiated this project, and sort of brings us to where we are now. And what CINA and CAOE bring to the table is more advanced geoinformatics capabilities. So things like searching through social media and social media scraping, and then building an actual application. And so that's what we're currently doing presently, is building an application where you can actually visualize these events and to get to the next slide, blend different sources of data and get a better indication of what's going on in Central America and in Mexico. So we're interested in building on TCOs writ large in the region. So not just cartels, but also gang activity as well. And then understanding more broadly what's going on in terms of civil society. So we have, prior to COVID, we had lots of talk about whether or not Central American migrants were coming for labor purposes, which is the most common reason that migration happens globally, or whether it was conflict-based. So what we've been interested in doing is actually using official government statistics to build these linkages and see, well, what does it look like? How bad are things? And just really trying to build that methodology out. And we have had some success with that, and I expect that we will continue to have success moving forward. As this aligns to national security goals, we were talking before we opened this up, and we aren't seeing lots of cartel violence in the United States, not at the levels that we see in Mexico and certainly not at the levels we're seeing in Central America. So there's no real risk of Narcos USA coming to Netflix anytime soon. But what we are seeing is, while the United States has been focused on the plethora of other issues that are out there, extremist ideologies and their spread online, COVID, terrorist organizations over the last 20 years, and fighting the global war on terrorism, cartels, while we have spent time focusing on them, and we should not, we should praise DEA and the State Department for the work that they've done to try to counter narcotics. But we have sort of turned away from that. And while we have turned away from that, they have been able to grow and morph and change and build in ways that that 10 years ago I didn't think was possible. But we're now seeing, and I don't know how close all of you all focus on social media, but we saw recently in the last week, TJNJ posting a video that's made its rounds on Twitter and other social media platforms that show a professionalized paramilitary organization with a unified battle dress, with decals and logos on their vehicles. They have built out technicals, so they have really come a long way and are a real force to be reckoned with. Second to that, they have real technological expertise, as Sam will discuss more broadly. There is not, there are, similarly with other countries in the world, a wealth of expertise, and that expertise is underpaid in the illicit sector. So they're able to get engineers, scientists to help them. And they also have diversified themselves, and I'll talk further about that later, and have been able to build upon their drug smuggling and their narcotics trafficking to sort of move beyond that. So it's still a central part of who they are, but they are now doing other things that do represent a significant threat to national security. With that, I'm going to pass it over to Sam.
Great, thanks, Marcus. So before we delve into the specifics of our particular research findings, I think it's important to establish some historical context in terms of how we're seeing the changing dynamics of Mexican cartels in particular over the past 20 years or so. I think that the research is quite vibrant on this, and there are multiple debates, there are competing explanations, but I've highlighted 4 that I think really attest to the increasing frequency and visibility of cartel activity and violence across Mexico. So the first is, of course, the collapse of the Colombian cartels and the eventual closing, I put closing in quotations, of the Caribbean trafficking routes. We know that the highly effective cooperative security arrangements between the United States and Colombia and regional partners led to very successful kind of debilitating processes in terms of disrupting particularly the Medellin and the Cali cartels from moving particularly cocaine into the United States through the Caribbean. What's interesting in the 1990s, and of course there are significant reasons why the Cali cartel and Medellin cartel collapsed, including internal conflicts on the own. But what we're seeing is a significant shift from the Caribbean as a center of narco trafficking routes to Central America, and in particular Mexico. A side note, interestingly enough, we're seeing a kind of a rise of narco trafficking in the Caribbean again, particularly from South America, Peru, Brazil, Venezuela. And the START team is actually putting together a proposal in which to examine a broader Western Hemisphere narco trafficking route in a very comprehensive way. Another significant explanation for the rise of TCO violence in Mexico deals with the democratization process and political change with the end of the Institutional Revolutionary Parties, the PRI, which was a dominating authoritarian party in Mexico for 70 years, that were defeated in 2000. Marcus and I actually just recently submitted a book chapter on the ways that the PRI employed authoritarian practices to sustain power in Mexico for 70 years. And one of the practices that they used was collaboration and co-optation of cartels in order to not only sustain but contain cartel activity and violence to particular areas of Mexico. So to keep them away from large city centers like Mexico City. And we know that that's no longer the case. And the final two explanations are significantly interrelated. So if you don't mind, I'm going to speak about them as one, just to save time. So the Mexican war on drugs that was commenced by President Calderon in 2006 which was based on very similar anti-narco trafficking campaigns that was conducted by the United States and Mexico. But unfortunately, what we see is that in Mexico, the context did not work very well. It has actually led to an increased intensity in violence across Mexico. It's long been empirically studied that kingpin removal and or leadership disruption is not effective in the Mexican context. It just leads cartels to confront each other more and fragment more. In fact, data shows that intensity of cartel activity and violence has increased after every major kingpin removal, whether captured or killed. And I think the reasons for kingpin removal not working in Mexico are very complex, and I'd be happy to elaborate on that in the question and answer period or also in a follow-up. But I'm going to move on more towards what we're all here for, and that's the preliminary results of our Tracking Cartel project. So we know that across Mexico, we are witnessing a reconfiguration of cartel and activity, particularly strategy, that illustrates four significant trends. The first is cartel fragmentation. The second is cartel territorial expansion. The third is cartel diversification and increase in criminal density. And the fourth is increased entanglement with both illicit and legal institutions and actors. We're going to kind of break these up in the following slides. So cartel fragmentation has led to far more agile and adaptable cartels, transnational criminal organizations in Mexico. In 2012, there was an estimated 60 to 80 criminal organizations operating across Mexico. And to be clear, when we're talking about criminal organizations in Mexico, we're talking about varying scales of intensity and also operational capacity. So this number includes major cartels, which are cartels with significant operational capacity, often transnational linkages. These are your cartels like Sinaloa, Zetas, CJNG. We're also talking about minor cartels or cartelitos, which are going to be smaller cartels, less operational capacity, limited to Mexico and in some of the Northern Triangle countries. And they often specialize in criminal activity, whether it's money laundering or extortion, and they work close with major cartels. We're also including pandillos, which are larger gangs, but not well enough organized to compete against cartels. These are your very regional and or local, particularly in urban areas, and then even small scale gangs. Today, there are over 200 gangs and criminal organizations registered by the Mexican government and kind of the broader scholarship and journalistic. Of significance, I think, is that the number of major cartels has risen in the last 15 years from 6 to a total of 9, which has significant implications to how this plays out spatially and geographically. So the map that we see of the major cartel operational zones is part of the GRU's Mexican Operational Zone Index. So what we have done is we've collected a significant amount of data, both primary data and secondary data, everything from official government statistics to US government statistics, also using data from social media, the news, a variety of different ways in which to attempt to collect high fidelity information on cartel operational zones at the municipality level. And this is important because this hasn't been done before. We have a pretty clear idea of what cartels operate at the state level in Mexico, but in terms of municipality, it becomes far more nuanced and far more complex. So as you can see, we have a significant number of municipalities that have anywhere between 1 and 2 major cartels presence, which obviously indicates that there's a dominant cartel that is exerting its influence and operational capacity. But in significant areas such as Juarez, Tijuana, around Mexico City, the ports on both the western and eastern coasts of Mexico, we're seeing upwards of 4 to 5 major cartels. So these are your very highly organized cartels competing, which of course leads to higher levels of violence for both Mexican citizens, but also a larger kind of global and regional security package. So as a result of cartel fragmentation, there has been significant expansion in geography when it comes to cartel activity and strategy across Mexico. To territorial expansion in Mexico, particularly related to large cartels, went from about 34% of municipalities having some type of presence and or control in 2001 to over 71% in 2012. And just last year, we're looking upwards of 86% of Mexican municipalities with some type of presence or total control of cartel activity. There is no better case in looking at geographic expansion of cartels than the Cartel de Jalisco Nueva Generación, or CJNG. Despite the fact that it is one of the youngest cartels in Mexico, it is considered to be one of, if not the most powerful and violent cartel in Mexico today. CJNG has successfully reconfigured what traditional arrangements of narco trafficking look like throughout Mexico. And what I mean by that is not just Mexico as being a transit country, but also a production zone, and thinking about what their two primary goals, profit and perpetuality, actually entails when it comes to maintaining a very strong presence. So we know that CJNG is operationally present in 23 of Mexico's 32 states, although they have alliances with minor cartels in all 32 states. There is a very specific spatial logic. And as geographers, this is something that Marcus and I are very attuned to, is that we've noticed early on that CJNG captured key ports in Veracruz, Manzanillo, and Lizardo, Cardenas, which is in the Gulf and Pacific side. What these ports did is they brought in the precursor chemicals that help supply methamphetamine and fentanyl to this major cartel. So we know that they have a very strong monopoly in terms of gaining those precursor chemicals from a geographic standpoint. We also know that CJNG has expanded north, particularly battling with the Sinaloa Federation to control key access of entry into the United States, but also the trafficking routes from central Mexico through Baja California, Sonora, Sinaloa, and Chihuahua. And we also know that more recently, CJNG has expanded to the East Coast, largely defeating the Gulf and Los Zetas for large production areas, but also indicating that they feel that the Eastern Coast is ripe for the ability to move narco trafficking back into the Caribbean, and which I think is something that we'll kind of touch on in a little bit. But what we're seeing is that as cartels expand, not just CJNG, but other cartels like Los Viegros and Nueva Plaza, their strength and power simultaneously grows. So our third finding is in regards to the fact that increasingly fragmented criminal organizations are diversifying their illicit activities. We're seeing increases in extortion, kidnapping, money laundering, fuel theft, to be able to ensure the two primary goals of cartels, profitability and perpetuation. What this means is that it allows for an increase in criminal density, more criminal activity and more criminal actors, both large-scale and small-scale criminal actors. More familiar forms of diversification, of course, are related to the emergence of new drug markets like synthetic drugs, methamphetamine, fentanyl. And as these drugs become more important in kind of illicit drug market economies, we'll see cartels pursue more in terms of their capacity and capabilities to both produce and traffic them. But one of the case studies that we pursued was of particular interest, given my love of all things avocado, is the increasing presence of cartels in co-opting agricultural products, which will relate to something that Marcus will talk to briefly. But if we think about it, given that cartels want to gain profit, considering that cartels want to perpetuate their power, it makes sense that diversification into economies that are massive. The avocado market in Mexico is worth $2.5 billion. Surprisingly, avocados grow very well alongside poppies, and it's this kind of same geo-environmental aspect to these growing spaces. So where you had a lot of growing, you also had a lot of growing avocados. So it seemed right to kind of establish this. And this point leads to the final point of our preliminary results, which Marcus will take over.
So one of the things that's interesting about cartels and transnational criminal organizations writ large is how they play in this illicit, licit, legal, illegal space. So they aren't just doing one type of crime. When we think about the sort of progenitors of our current system, and we look back at the sort of Colombia cartels as these started to develop in the 70s, they were focused on one thing. Originally marijuana trafficking, and then it became cocaine trafficking, as because it was more profitable and you could sell, volume was smaller and all of that. But these newer cartels have vastly diversified what it is that they are doing, and in doing so, they have really built themselves into these spaces, these geographies that are licit, illicit, and legal and illegal. We use them sort of interchangeably, but really what that means is for something to be licit or illicit, that is whether or not it is socially acceptable or not. And then for something that is legal or illegal, that is codified in law. These things, the meanings of these things are culturally and socially bound. So they change depending on where you are in the world. If you are in a location where the only source of income is to do something that is illegal, then you are going to do that illegal thing, and it is going to be licit because people are going to be accepting of that illegal thing. This is really the case in places like Afghanistan, where you have poppy growing by normal farmers and poppy trafficking by small families cross border. It is illegal internationally, globally, but and it is a way of really subsistence farming for people in Afghanistan and other parts of the world as well. So you have these groups that are doing things in Mexico that are clearly illegal, but that are accepted by the population, either through coercion or because it is legitimately the only way of having a safe existence. And as Sam was saying, we're seeing them go into things like oil trafficking and oil theft, avocado growing, palm oil production, cattle production. These are all money laundering activities. Their main source of income is still from the drug trade, and that is something that is still growing. But we expect to see an increase in diversification. One example of this is sort of when a government takes on a criminal organization, if they aren't able to completely destroy that criminal enterprise and the desire for whatever it is that they are selling or producing, then those organizations just morph and change. That isn't to say that governments should just back away and let cartels do what they do. It really means that you have to really focus and redouble your efforts to make sure that what you're doing, that whatever it is that you're doing that's going to be an action-based activity, whether it's Northcom working with Mexican Marines and Army to try to root out these organizations and their paramilitary branches, you have to back that up with policy, actual policies that create alternatives to joining cartels, participating in cartel activities, growing for cartels. And we see in the news in open sources that cartels are expanding. Their influence is expanding globally. Recently, there are reports that they're working with European organized crime out of Amsterdam to create new, highly purified forms of methamphetamine, or crystal meth, that is much more potent than what we've seen over the last 15, 20 years. They're then shipping this to Southeast Asia and Australia. So they're building a conflict with Southeast Asian cartels, which currently control that market space. What's super interesting about this geographically is that the cartels, despite owning, when I say owning, I mean they control ports along Mexico's west coast. They aren't necessarily shipping drugs directly to Australia. They're shipping precursors and persons who are skilled in drug manufacturing to places like Amsterdam, and then using the port of Amsterdam to then ship globally. This is really fascinating sort of tactic that they're using, because you wouldn't necessarily expect that a Mexican cartel is going to be shipping out of Amsterdam to Sydney. So this globalization of the Mexican cartels is really an innovation that you would expect with any normal transnational business. The difference here is that they are producing illegal goods. So yes, we do believe that we're going to continue to see increased diversification activities. They're going to become increasingly globalized, and really they're, as I mentioned earlier, and as Sam's mentioned, they are professionalizing their paramilitary activities. So they are becoming a real, honest threat to Mexican security forces, whether it's the police at the local or federal level, or the Mexican military. Regardless of how well trained you are, they are the cartels, specifically cartels like CJNG, are absorbing former military personnel from Mexico and Central America. And so we're seeing this diversification and this securitization of their business and of their trade that really goes beyond what we've really seen in the past. Sam?
Yeah, so one of the things that also we have to contend with in terms of this research, and obviously this is something that we had not anticipated as we were going through the data and collecting the data process, but I think is really significant, is thinking through how COVID-19 as a global pandemic has impacted cartel activity. And I think what we're starting to see from other researchers and journalists and so on and so forth, and policymakers to a certain extent, that there are two schools of thought. So one school of thought claims that transnational criminal organizations are going to have to fundamentally shift how they do their business. And on the other side, we're seeing individuals argue that COVID-19, yes, will have a kind of large shift, but in reality, illicit economies are relatively stable and they'll just find ways to adapt and become more agile in what will be a post-COVID-19 world. I think that both have value, and I think it's still a little bit too early to determine the level of impact that COVID-19 will have on drug cartels, particularly in Mexico, because we are dealing with limited data and also kind of issues with the data reporting process. Of course, political narratives being significantly impactful in the Mexican context. And then, of course, there are broken supply chains, data, and shifting markets that have yet to really emerge, although I can see that coming up in the next few months. That being said, I think that there are two important things to kind of pay attention to with how cartels are responding to the COVID-19 pandemic. The first, I think, we have to focus a lot of attention on cartels' revenue streams. So I've been following a lot of data that looks at the prices of drugs increasing, particularly cocaine, methamphetamine, and fentanyl across the United States and Australia, which is important. I'll come back to Australia in just a minute. For example, in the West Coast, we are seeing prices almost double. So currently methamphetamine is going for about $2,000 a pound. Increases in the Midwest and the East Coast are smaller, but they still show variability in the prices of methamphetamine, and also depend on kind of local production in these geographical contexts. But what's interesting is if we shift our attention to Australia, which we don't think about a lot when we're thinking about Mexican cartels' impact on drug trade in the United States, but Australia, the price of cocaine has doubled more. And in some areas upwards of 3 times its original cost. And it's interesting because Australia is the primary illicit market, meaning Australians are willing to pay higher than the US or Europeans. So keeping an eye on what the cost of drugs in Australia is going for allows us to basically make educated guesses about the resiliency and the number of drugs that they'll allow to enter into the United States. So we'll see prices increase to a certain extent before people will look for other places and suppliers. So I think that Australian markets are essentially going to stabilize US prices. US prices are going to come down, which means that the flow of drugs into the United States from Mexico is largely continuing unhindered. But we're also seeing struggles to overcome issues with getting precursor chemicals from China into Mexico, where then they can create methamphetamine and fentanyl, which is also an important thing. We know that cartels function at their peak when they're able to exploit legitimate commerce. So as legitimate commerce slows down, as shipping slows down, as trade slows down, we know that cartel activity is going to slow down, so they're going to look for alternative ways. I think this will be interesting to see what happens on the US southern border, and whether or not we see more brazen efforts to cross the border in other ways than what we are used to seeing now. A second significant source of revenue for cartels relates to bribery and extortion, particularly extortion in the Mexican context. What's interesting about extortion is during a global pandemic, as we're starting to see the Mexican economy taking a massive hit, the special balance between maintaining your revenue from extorting individuals, but also recognizing that a lot of individuals cannot maintain that because of the limited mobility that we're seeing in Mexico, so much the United States, increase in unemployment, so on and so forth. And cartels want to perpetuate. They want to make sure that they are able to continue to do what they're doing. I'm sure some of you have been aware of or have heard of cartels, early stories of cartels being philanthropic, right? That there's all these new stories about Sinaloa and CJNG providing humanitarian aid packages, and I put those in quotations because I think it's interesting and almost contradictory. But cartels are stepping up into the vacuum that has been left by the Mexican government in terms of providing essentials to Mexican peoples. We're seeing this in 11 states currently, but I think it's going to spread. We're seeing TCOs provide assistance with food, job opportunities, so on and so forth. And while this may seem surprising, philanthropic processes and legacies have been ongoing in Mexico. It's been ongoing in transnational organized crime for a very significant amount of time. But what's different is that key players like CJNG, smaller gang Los Viajeros, which are known for its political assassinations, are also playing a role in these philanthropic endeavors. So what is clear to me is that we're starting to see which major cartels have better resilience in terms of the financial burden that a slow movement of narco trafficking engages, right? So if cartels are able to provide more packages, if cartels are able to provide incomes, jobs, so on and so forth, we're seeing their greater resilience. It's going to be smaller gangs and smaller cartels that are going to have to become more agile in this space. I wouldn't be surprised if we're starting to see higher extortion rates in places where you have smaller gangs, places like the East Coast, particularly Quintana Roo, where Cancun is located, because basically whether cartels can continue to use their financial resources to keep up this effort will provide further insight into whether or not they can weather the pandemic further than they already have. The next thing that I think is really important is thinking about COVID-19's effect on cartel competition and conflict. Because cartels have varying liquidity levels, there will be different tolerance levels. So we are already seeing increased competitions for drug plazas and routes across Mexico. To provide some nuance in this conversation, so wealthy cartels like Sinaloa, CJNG are testing each other's tolerance, strategically hitting drug plazas that were seemingly stable, but then quickly moving to consolidate their own territory. So we're starting to see kind of some pulling back there. We know that CJNG has moved into 2 new states, Veracruz and Puebla, this year. And I believe that this is an effort to, one, test the strength of the the East Coast cartels, and also they see an opportunity to expand into the Caribbean. I think they think that it's weak and easily able to confront them. And we're also seeing smaller cartels becoming more violent against major cartels, cartels that they usually have some loose connection with, because again, they're testing their resiliency to market disruption and so on and so forth. I think what we'll see once the data shakes out in a couple months from now is that most wealthy gangs will be able to continue to do what they do as they are. Smaller gangs are going to fragment. We're going to see a greater fragmentation of the mini cartel, the cartelitos, as well as the gangs. And then we're also going to see a lot of the, again, major cartels consolidate their power within their particular territories.
So as far as future directions for the project, we are still working on this project. We're still ongoing and will be throughout the end of January. But we're always interested in well, what's next with this? And really there are lots of different vectors to look at. Obviously, as Sam was just saying, understanding how COVID is going to affect cartels. The data that's going to come out of the next probably year is going to be fascinating. Once we have a vaccine, how the Mexican government selects to distribute that vaccine is going to be interesting and is going to be telling, and may present an avenue for cartels to try to muscle in on that and sell either counterfeit vaccines or legitimate vaccines that they've just gotten, that they've stolen. So COVID itself is going to be a huge future direction of what that's going to look like. Beyond that, we're also interested in how cartels are now interacting with human trafficking and human smuggling. Historically, in the literature, in the academic literature, it's been pretty clear that traffickers and smugglers of humans are sort of have an antagonistic relationship with cartels. And quite famously, we've seen the caravans, and we have seen photos and videos of people at the border trying to cross and claim sanctuary, or try to cross illegally through the deserts of Arizona. But a recent study that was conducted by some researchers at the University of California, Irvine, for a DARPA project, believe it or not, were interviewing Central American migrants, recent Central American migrants, and the vast majority of them, upwards of 95%, claimed that they came to the United States through tunnels. Now, we didn't get descriptions of these tunnels, but that's sort of a fascinating development, because tunnels obviously require technical skill to build out. And we know that cartels are using them to smuggle drugs into the United States and weapons out of the United States. But if what we're sort of seeing is this burgeoning relationship between human smuggling, human trafficking, and cartels, that's very interesting, and yet another sort of revenue generating option for cartels. So we're looking at those kinds of things, and if in fact cartels are moving into sort of human smuggling, human trafficking, that then provides an interesting sort of avenue for returning to the sort of starts core of terrorism and counterterrorism and responding to terrorism, because then you have this avenue that special interest aliens can sort of pursue, whereby a known terrorist who's on a terrorism watch list simply pays a cartel to help get smuggled into the United States. DHS tells us that so DHS publicly released information on these special interest aliens, suggests that between 3,000 and 4,000 are encountered yearly. Most of them are encountered at airports and try to get into the United States through air traffic. But if in fact cartels are expanding their business in this area, then we could see more of that along the southern border, which would be fascinating and terrifying. So there are lots of different avenues that we would like to pursue and like to look at with cartels. I think those are the sort of the top level ones. So as we sort of conclude, what this project has been focused on most closely is trying to provide and build the actionable intelligence and security information. One thing that START really prides itself on is identifying open source information that can then be used by Homeland Security, State Department, DoD, so that they can go talk to their counterparts internationally and if we can discover something in the open source that they've only had in classified channels, they may not want to give away their classified information, but if they can point to a news article or to an academic study in their meetings with foreign officials, then that then bolsters their claims. And it provides the evidence that they need to say, hey, this is a thing that we need to take care of and we need to work together on this. And then we're working on higher fidelity collection capabilities and location intelligence. We have produced a very accurate gazetteer for Mexico. So we now have tiny hamlets and what in the United States we would call unincorporated communities. So while in the United States we have a very good understanding of locations, and Google has that as well. Sort of typical gazetteers that you have. If you are interviewing someone and they say they come from a certain location, you may not have that location in your gazetteer. So we've built a more comprehensive gazetteer for that, so that we can increase the location intelligence for our Homeland Security enterprise. And then we're looking by trying to bind together different open source options. So social media, news articles, foreign government official statistics. We're trying to improve signal detection so that we can get so that we really can step back from the border and push the border further south. And then, as we've been saying throughout, increase situational and spatial awareness of TCO activity throughout Central America and Mexico. Overall, I mean, this is a really fascinating project, and it's a fascinating area of study that we're very keen in continuing to do. There's a lot to be mined that has not been looked at and that we've sort of overlooked in the last 20 years, and we're sort of trying to foster that growth, that we come in and we point attention to this. And with that, we're happy to take questions, and thank you all for listening to us. I know we're a bit long-winded, but we are academics. It's kind of what we do. So thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you, Marcus and Sam, both. That was really informative. We have not hit on this topic in the National Security Forum before, so it was very helpful for you to give that detailed information. I have several questions, but I would like to start with Mike Matthews. And many of you in NSF know Mike is our protective security agent from DHS CISA for the state of Nevada. Mike joined us and joined the panel to make the connection between the cartel issues and what's going on in Nevada. So Mike, I'd like to turn it over to you to ask any specific questions you have about Nevada, and then I'll turn to the Q&A session.
First off, I'd like to thank you both for presenting this information. It was absolutely fascinating and quite honestly mind-boggling on how much, at least I don't know in this realm, and what a huge void there is. So I appreciate your products that you guys put out, as well as this presentation. Thank you. So I guess one of the big things when we know there's significant drug pathways through Nevada and to Nevada, through Reno, I-80, I-95, and especially down south through Las Vegas, coming up through Arizona, as well as coming in through Southern California, through San Diego and Los Angeles. And so my primary question is, and we kind of touched on this earlier, is what should we be concerned about when we're talking about critical infrastructure? What type of spillovers could there be that we should be paying attention to using with these drug pathways? What are the impacts that we're going to see? Is it going to be that they're just protecting their own product and their supply chains? Or is there other potential things that we're seeing in Mexico that we could extrapolate into the United States?
Yeah, I mean, so one of the really difficult things about drug trafficking in the United States is that because you can travel freely between states and police can't stop someone without probable cause, we do see lots of trafficking, and it is very difficult to stop. And this was something that we looked at and used as an analog to look into the possible success rate of nuclear or radiological smuggling throughout the United States. And so that's a really perplexing question, and it's $1 million question of how it is that you can pick out which car it is on the highway that's trafficking the material. And so I think that's going to be of continued interest. I think from a critical infrastructure perspective, there was a recent article that came out from Reuters doing an investigation of cell towers in Mexico. And I know cell towers are really in vogue in the United States now with the attacks on 5G. But one thing that cartels are doing in Mexico is they are basically building repeaters. So they're building their own cell antennas onto, and they're using the electrical power that that's coming, and they're sort of just like siphoning it off. I don't think that has happened in the United States, but it does give them in Mexico the ability to have encrypted communications throughout their strongholds. I think if we poke at cartels enough, that in regions in the United States where cartels are strong, we could see that sort of thing happening. So I think that would be one of the risks to critical infrastructure. But beyond that, I think the most extreme risk to critical infrastructure is going to be something akin to cyber. So for example, something that we saw a few years ago, and this was phenomenally successful. A transnational criminal organization was interested in shipping containers through the port of Amsterdam and managed to hack into the port of Amsterdam's database and make the containers that they were interested in shipping invisible. If a drug cartel manages to do this at a US port, then you now have whatever materials they're trying to smuggle in, most likely drugs, but if they're partnered with another organization, a terrorist organization, for example, then they could smuggle in chemical, biological, nuclear, radiological, conventional explosives, what have you, completely undetected. Now, I will say that border security forces have done a lot of work. They've studied that case. There are case studies about that. So I don't personally know enough about cyber to know whether that is still a concern, but I mean, even when you have the most well-funded groups in the world, like Twitter, for example, we just saw Twitter, a significant hack on Twitter. So these sorts of cyber attacks on facilities are going to continue to happen, and cartels are definitely capable of that. Sam, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think briefly, I think rather in Mexico, what we're seeing are direct attacks on critical infrastructure. So we're seeing cartels use their weaponry against critical infrastructure. I don't foresee that being the case in the United States. I do think that co-optation would be the more plausible route in terms of cartels impacting critical infrastructure in the United States to protect their profit, but as well as just to perpetuate their existence in the United States, whether it's through cell phone towers or ensuring that vehicles continue to move from place A to B. It's interesting that Marcus brought up cyber because I think that's an important thing, but a lot of people tend to forget that cartels are worth a significant amount of money. I mean, CJNG alone has over 20 billion in assets, and that's a lot of money to play with in terms of a wide range of both illicit and illicit activities that could impact critical infrastructure in numerous ways.
Agreed. I don't see them directly influencing critical infrastructure as you indicated. However, I do see their byproducts, and I see their supply chains and their methods to import their products into the United States as a direct pipeline. So I appreciate your thoughts on that. Thanks, Maureen. I'll turn the floor over to the rest of the questions. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Mike, and I really appreciate this discussion. We have several very insightful questions, so I'm just going to jump right in here. Question about the comments that you made in the very beginning with this kingpin elimination strategy that Mexico tried. Wondered if you have looked at any correlations between the kingpin strategy violence that resulted the violence that resulted in Mexico and compared that to the Syracuse drug market violence study. And I'm not sure when that was published, but by Jerry Radcliffe at Temple University, that looked at rise in violence in a once stable drug market that was disrupted because the leaders were either killed or arrested. Is there any comparison between what happens here and what happened in Mexico?
So I'm not familiar with that specific study. We see, or what's interesting is that the kingpin removal strategy actually comes out of counterterrorism. So effectively, the United States has been very good at removing kingpins and leadership positions in specific organizations. We also see this in not just Al-Qaeda in the Middle East, but also previous counterterrorism activities in Southeast Asia. So the removal of JI leadership, the removal of KMM leadership as well. And what's interesting about Mexico is what we're seeing is a transition. So originally, kingpin in the 1970s and 80s would have been relatively successful because it was usually families that then maintained strong leadership positions. So if one member of the family was removed, chances are the rest of the family would have been removed as well. But because of the increasing fragmentation of cartels, we're starting to see positions break up even further. So for example, with the arrest of El Chapo in 2014 and then subsequently arrest in 2017, everyone thought the Sinaloa Federation was going to split between the three younger brothers. But what you ended up seeing was that the actual enforcer, the head of the enforcer, took over quite significantly. And there was, of course, some minor fragmentation, particularly in the southern states, but for the most part was able to maintain. That was unexpected. The same can be said about the millennial cartel, which emerged, CJNG emerged from. So as cartels become more tolerant and risk averse from a leadership and hierarchical perspective, I think kingpin removal is going to be more and more less viable.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, Sam. I appreciate that answer. I want to move through because we've got some other really important questions. One is, what's the balance in the cartel portfolios right now from, you mentioned avocados, which obviously we all eat a lot of avocados. So avocados and other agricultural products versus, their standard business of drugs. Is that percentage increasing now? And is it a sizable size of their market right now?
That's a great question. So yes, we are seeing percentage of other activities increasing. Whether it's sizable enough to replace narco trafficking, I think is debatable. In my opinion, I think that narco trafficking is still key to a lot of Mexican cartels. I think that will continue to be the case for a significant amount of time. But as cartels start to recognize that diversifying their portfolios becomes profitable and also done in ways that are less threatening to their ability to perpetuate, will be interesting to see whether or not we see even bigger increases. So, avocados, illicit fuel tap thefts are relatively in and out. You go in, you steal a bunch of avocado trucks, you put them into an illicit market, you make a lot of money. But as we're starting to see cartels like CJNG, also a smaller cartel in the area, start to produce avocados themselves, whether security forces will intervene in that particular space or not, I think will be a true test of whether we see diversification becoming more significant in revenues than narco trafficking.
Excellent. Thanks, Sam. Marcos, I think this question is for you. You mentioned the paramilitary operations that were taking place. Is the primary source of weaponry for the cartels still coming from the United States?
So this is something that Sam and I talk about quite frequently, honestly, because we do see individuals buying weapons in the United States, and then they show up in Mexico. But as I sort of alluded to, the cartels have been able to get engineers and really build manufacturing plants. So they've been able to manufacture their own weapons, modify weapons. They've been able to get parts from China. So it really is like with all arms trafficking and international trade, the easiest place to get weapons is the United States. Mexico has, I believe it is still the case that it has one legal gun store where you can buy guns legally. But we know that weapons proliferate. We know also that they are stealing weapons from the Mexican military, Mexican police force, and they are also trafficking from Central American countries. Any kinds of thefts that they can get from there as well.
Interesting. And of course, some of that Mexican military hardware is probably also coming from the United States as well.
Yeah.
So you mentioned in the very beginning, you talked about coming to this out of the studies of some of the Islamic extremist organizations. And so we have a question that looks at the parallels with ISIS. And ISIS started out small, and it was, it was accomplishing a lot because it was sort of flying under the radar. And then as it grew and grew and grew and became larger and larger, it got on everybody's radar and became more of a target. Is that sort of the model that you expect with the cartels as they get larger and larger and larger? Is there sort of a critical mass with which they attract so much attention, both from within Mexico, but maybe from the external organizations like the United States, that they, that they become too large for their own good, and not as effective as when they were smaller groups just operating sort of out of view?
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective as a geographer, the thing that's really interesting about ISIL and why they became such a threat is sort of twofold. One, they grew very large, right? So they became a big threat. They became this sort of enemy that was highly stylized. They had a huge online presence. They were able to successfully radicalize people all over the world. And they were able to get foreign fighters to come from all over the world. So in that regard, they were much more effective communicators than Al-Qaeda or any other terrorist organization that we had seen previously. But from a geographic perspective and a geopolitical perspective, one of the things that they did that I think really was shocking to governments is that they went in and they declared themselves their own country. And this in and of itself is not necessarily new, but they had this disregard for international borders. If they had come in and said, we now control Syria, or we now are going to separate from part of Syria, that would have been a different narrative than our caliphate encompasses part of Syria and part of Iraq. That was new and just really shocking. I don't really see cartels sort of pursuing that same geographic goal. I mean, Sam and I have talked about this, and Sam, feel free to elaborate, but we are sort of concerned that we could fall into a narco state issue where they become so powerful, so well trained, so well funded, that they really just become this sort of quasi-government in sections of Mexico, and Mexico just has no control over those regions.
That's really insightful. Thanks. That really tells you quite a difference between their operational modes compared to ISIL. And actually, pulling the thread on that, let's look at the effect that they're having on civil society in Mexico and the confidence in the government's ability to function. You said, I think, Sam, that there are parts of the municipalities that are now essentially 86% controlled by the cartels. What's happening fundamentally in civil society? We hear the sensational stories about the cartels, but what's really happening to people on the ground?
Yeah, this is a great question. Marcus and I have actually been thinking a lot about this, and currently drafting some papers related to what we call narco governance. So this idea that cartels are coming in and providing kind of governance structures that then kind of shape how Mexican society is existing within particular spaces. I think on one hand, it's important to recognize that cartels have significant influence and significant control in very small geographic areas of Mexico. Meaning, if you walk down the street in Mexico City, or if you're in Acapulco, or if you're in Tulum, you're not going to recognize the presence of cartels. What we're seeing is an uneven distribution, both territorially and the level of intensity across Mexico, of cartels being able to shape and influence society. I think one of the most significant ways in which cartels are shaping society in the last couple of years is we're seeing higher increases and higher rates of extortion. So everyday citizens and smaller businesses to large businesses are basically forced to either pay rent, las rentas, to particular cartel organizations, whether those cartels have dominance in an area. So that's a protection rent, meaning you are paying for the protection of the cartels in case conflict breaks out. But even just general extortion. So you want to travel from place A to place B, you're transitioning territory, you're going to have to pay a road tax or a toll or so and so forth. So I think we're seeing an increase in illicit and illegal activities in Mexico being experienced by Mexican citizens that were not the same rates that they would have been previously.
Yeah, that's really helpful, Sam. Marcus, do you have anything to add to that?
So, I mean, the only thing I have to add is that Mexico is a very interesting place because it's one of those places where you can go and safely vacation and have a world-class meal and see amazing archaeological sites and their universities are fantastic, and in some ways their government is on par with ours. So their statistical agency, their equivalent to the Census Bureau, is really as good as ours in many ways. But at the same time, they have this civil society is suffering on both ends because there is a high level of corruption in Mexican government. So police, specifically local level police specifically, are extorting civilians at really high rates. Something like 50, in some states, something about 50% of the population claims to have been extorted, either by a criminal organization or by the police. There's not a lot of trust. So civil society doesn't necessarily trust the police. Interestingly, they do trust the Marines and the Army quite highly. So as you go further up their federalism ladder, you see more solidarity. Civil society feels better about the government, but at the local level, you do see this sort of interplay of criminality between local government and the cartels, and it's a really fascinating sort of position that Mexican civilians find themselves in.
Excellent, excellent. Well, thank you for that. I'm going to close with one question about U.S. strategy. The sort of what do we do moving forward for bringing it back from a national security strategy for us. We've tried a lot of things in the past. We've tried things like trying to turn one criminal, transnational criminal organization against another. Sort of fueling the fire. We did a bit of that in Colombia. We've obviously tried arresting and rearresting kingpins. As you look at the data, can you say anything about what worked and what we should really be thinking about in the future?
So I'll go first on that. I mean, I tended to see substance abuse as a public health issue, and we know economically that drug abuse is something that's price inelastic. So it doesn't matter how difficult or how expensive you make it to get it. People will go to whatever lengths they have to. So there's no real way of rooting out drug cartels and sort of there being no drug trade. That's I mean, even if we legalized every form of drug, cartels would still be able to manufacture them more cheaply than you could legally manufacture them. So I think part of this goes to looking at like Gina Ligon, who's at the University of Nebraska and is a START affiliate. She's looked at groups, terrorist organizations and terrorist leadership, and she thinks that for the managerial class, basically, there's a way to absorb them into civil society, into governance, into private industry. They have the skills, the same skills that Fortune 500 companies are after, right? But they're criminal enterprises. So, you know, to some extent, you can fold these criminal organizations into sort of traditional licit and legal society. But we have to continue a policy of building economic alternatives for people if they have the ability to make the same amount of money doing something else. I mean, so these are your lower level operatives, your lower level people. This is the most stable form of income for them. And that's really what it sort of comes down to at that level. Now, for the kingpin level, for the leadership, you know, some of them could be satiated by being brought into government and being a member of the legislature. But some of them are real diehards. They recognize that this is what they do. They like it. They really like the violence, and they will go down fighting. And there really isn't anything else that we can do with that. They're sort of lost.
Well, that does absolutely sum up where we are, and I think the challenges. Thank you so much, both Marcus and Sam, and thank you for our attendees who went over. We do have participating today. We've had some federal law or non-federal law enforcement, some intelligence folks who are joining us. And I know we have others who are in our network who will be very interested in watching this video. So I thank you for your time and attention now. I will, if you would indulge us, I would like to make some direct email connections to some of the folks who are on the line who didn't necessarily get, and follow up on the question actually about the kingpin strategy. So with that, thank you very much. Bill, do you have any parting comments? This was fantastic. You guys did a great job. We are very happy about the partnership with START so that we can get into some of these hard issues. And I thank everybody who stuck with us as we ran a few minutes over to listen to a hard topic first thing in the morning for us. And hopefully we will be able to look into this issue later as it pertains specifically to actions that Mike and others are working in Nevada and the other states and locally. So with that, thank you very much. I look forward to seeing everybody else at our next presentation on the future of pandemics. And please let me know if you have any other questions and we will connect you. There was a great link that Aaron posted in the chat box. So if you haven't clicked on that, do that quickly before I end the session. To the Tracking Cartels infographics, and I will also send that out with our video. So thank you again.
Thank you.
Take care, be safe.
Thank you.